The factory stood on the Hudson River like a second shoreline. For generations, anyone crossing near North Tarrytown could look toward the water and see more than brick walls. Smokestacks, rail sidings, and loading bays. They were looking at the center of a town's working life. Inside, metal moved from station to station. Bodies were welded. Engines were fitted. Paint was sprayed. Doors, dashboards, seats, glass trim, and wiring came together piece by piece until a car rolled out complete. Polished and ready for the road, outside the gates, life arranged itself around the plant. Families knew the shifts. Streets filled when the line let out. Cafes, stores, schools, union halls, and neighborhoods all felt the rhythm of the factory. A paycheck from GM was not just income. It was rent, groceries, a mortgage, a child's future, a kind of security that gave shape to everyday life. At its height, the General Motors plant in North Tarrytown was more than an industrial site. It was the economic engine of the village. It employed thousands. It worked across shifts. It gave the town a reason to see itself as part of something larger than the Hudson Valley. And then, in June 1996, the line stopped. The factory that had survived the birth of the automobile age, the rise of Chevrolet, the Second World War, the golden years of American car culture, and decades of changing models finally closed. The buildings would later be torn down. The waterfront would be cleared. The place where workers once built Chevrolets, Buicks, Oldsmobiles, Pontiacs, and minivans would begin a long transformation into something almost unrecognizable. But the deeper question is not simply why the plant closed. It is how a factory that once helped define a town became too old, too costly, and too constrained for the company it had served for nearly a century. To understand that ending, you have to begin before General Motors, before Chevrolet, before the American automobile had fully chosen what it wanted to become. You have to begin with a river. The Hudson made the site possible. Long before the plant became associated with GM, the waterfront tied the area to movement. Boats, railroads, materials, workers, and finished goods could all pass through this narrow industrial corridor between the river and the land. Tarrytown and North Tarrytown sat close enough to New York City to belong to its economic orbit, but far enough away to develop their own industrial character. The railroad ran along the river. The waterfront offered access. The geography invited factories. So when the automobile industry began to take shape at the end of the 19th century, this was the kind of place where an ambitious company could imagine the future being built. But in those early years, the future was still uncertain. The automobile had not yet become the gasoline-powered machine that would dominate American life. Steam, electricity, and gasoline were all competing for attention. Engineers and investors understood that the horse-drawn world was beginning to change, but no one could yet be certain which technology would win. In 1899, the automobile industry arrived in the Tarrytown area through the Mobile Company of America, which produced Walker steam cars. These were not the standardized mass-market vehicles that would later pour from assembly lines. They belonged to an earlier, stranger, more experimental moment. A steam car was not simply transportation. It was a bet. It asked buyers to believe that a new machine could replace an older way of moving through the world. It asked workers to build products whose future was not guaranteed. It asked a town to accept that the age of horses, carriages, and familiar rhythms might be giving way to something louder, faster and less predictable. Inside that early factory, the sound would not yet have been the mature rhythm of modern automobile production. It would have been the sound of machine work, hand-fitting, adjustment, testing, and improvisation. Men worked around parts that were still being refined. The product itself was still trying to prove it belonged. Then the industry moved. Steam lost ground. Gasoline gained it. The American automobile began to take the shape that would define the 20th century. Longer range, easier fueling, greater speed, and eventually mass production. The Mobile Company faded, but the site did not. The factory passed into the hands of Maxwell Briscoe, part of the next wave of gasoline automobile manufacturing. In those early decades, car companies rose and vanished quickly. A brand that looked promising one year could be gone within a few more. Capital shifted. Names changed. Designs evolved. The industry was unstable, but the Tarrytown site survived because it could be useful to whoever came next. That became one of the plant's first lessons. The name on the gate could change. The work could change, but the industrial logic of the place remained. Then Chevrolet arrived. In the mid-1910s, Chevrolet production brought the plant into the orbit of a company that would soon become one of the most important names in American automotive history. The Chevrolet 490, introduced as an affordable car for a growing market, represented a new kind of promise. The automobile was no longer only a curiosity for enthusiasts or a luxury for the wealthy. It was becoming an ordinary object, a household object, a practical machine that could change where people lived, how they worked, how far they traveled, and how they imagined freedom. When Chevrolet became part of General Motors in 1918, the North Tarrytown plant entered a much larger world. It was no longer just a factory trying to survive in a volatile industry. It became one working piece inside one of the most powerful manufacturing systems in America. General Motors did not simply build cars. It organized brands, suppliers, dealers, financing, engineering, parts, distribution, and production into an immense industrial network. A plant like North Tarrytown had a defined purpose inside that network. Take designs, parts, labor, machinery, and time, and turn them into finished vehicles at scale. That scale changed everything. The success of the plant depended on repetition. Parts arrived. Bodies moved. Workers performed specific tasks. Each station had its role. Each person handled a small part of a much larger process. The work could be exhausting. It could be narrow. It could demand the same motion again and again, but the combined result was extraordinary. Thousands of separate components became a car someone could drive away. That is what made the plant powerful. Not one worker, not one machine, not one department. It was the coordination of all of them. The plant turned human labor into industrial rhythm, and that rhythm did not stay inside the walls. A factory of that size becomes a public clock. People know when it starts. They know when it changes shifts. They know when traffic will thicken near the gates. They know which families depend on it, which stores serve it, which streets carry its workers home. For many households, the plant meant stability. It meant a route into the middle class. It meant the possibility of buying a home, raising children, paying bills, and building a life with some expectation that next week's paycheck would come. The work was not easy. Industrial labor rarely is. The plant gave wages, but it also took strength. It offered security, but it demanded discipline. It produced pride, but also fatigue. Still, for generations, it gave people something concrete to belong to. The factory also created a social world. Workers came from different backgrounds, neighborhoods, families, and communities. Outside the plant, their lives might have been separated by class, ethnicity, language, race, or local geography. Inside, they were connected by the line. The line did not care where someone came from. If one station slowed, the next station felt it. If one part failed, the whole process suffered. Cooperation was not sentimental. It was built into the work, but that did not mean the factory was peaceful. Industrial life carried conflict over wages, speed, discipline, seniority, safety, race, gender, power, and dignity. The plant gave workers livelihoods, but it also gave them reasons to organize, bargain, resist, and demand more. That tension became part of its identity. Tarrytown's plant was opportunity and pressure at the same time. It gave the town strength, but it also tied the town's fate to a corporation whose decisions would not always be local. During the Second World War, the plant's purpose changed again. Like many American factories, it was pulled into wartime production. The North Tarrytown plant was retooled for aircraft-related work, including wings for Grumman torpedo bombers. A factory that had built civilian vehicles now became part of a national war effort. This shift revealed what industrial capacity really meant. A factory was not just a building with machines. It was organized skill. It was logistics. It was trained labor. It was managers, suppliers, tools, schedules, and discipline. In peacetime, that capacity could build cars. In wartime, it could be redirected toward aircraft components and military production. The workers inside the plant were no longer connected only to buyers, dealers, and American roads. They were connected to a global conflict. A panel, a fitting, a machined part, or a wing section could leave the Hudson Valley and become part of a much larger military system. The plant floor became one small front in a war fought far beyond New York. The war also changed who entered industrial work. Like other wartime factories, Tarrytown employed women in roles that had often been closed to them before the emergency. Some would leave industrial work after the war. Others would remain in related fields. But for that period, the factory reflected a national transformation. The urgent need for production had redrawn the boundaries of who belonged on the shop floor. When the war ended, the automobile returned to the center of American life. The post-war years became the great age of the American car. Highways expanded. Suburbs spread. Families bought vehicles not only because they needed transportation, but because the car had become a symbol of arrival. A car meant movement. It meant privacy. It meant possibility. It meant a driveway, a weekend trip, a commute, a family vacation, a teenage rite of passage, a country increasingly designed around the road. North Tarrytown helped build that world. The models changed across the decades, but the plant's purpose remained constant: turn American demand into metal, glass, rubber, paint, and motion. The vehicles that passed through the plant were not abstract production numbers. They were sedans, station wagons, trucks, family cars, compacts, and later minivans. To workers, they arrived as shells, panels, wires, seats, dashboards, and unfinished bodies. To buyers, they appeared as complete machines. Carrying the shine of the showroom, the factory connected those two realities. It turned labor most people never saw into objects millions of people used. In 1963, the plant produced the 50 millionth Chevrolet, a gold Impala SS. That single car became a ceremonial object, but what it represented was far larger than one vehicle. Behind it stood decades of production planning, dealer networks, suppliers, workers, advertising, and consumer faith in the American automobile. It was a celebration of scale, but scale can hide weakness. Even during its stronger years, the plant carried a problem that would grow harder to ignore. It was old. Its age gave it prestige. It connected the plant to the dawn of the automobile industry. It made the site historic, but the same history also created limits. Early automobile plants were not designed for the manufacturing demands of the late 20th century. Many were constrained by older layouts, surrounding development, railroad lines, waterfront boundaries, and buildings added over time. They could be repaired, expanded, and adapted, but only to a point. Modern automobile manufacturing increasingly favored large, flexible single-story plants, with room for efficient material flow. Automation, model changes, and expansion. Space mattered. Layout mattered. The ability to retool quickly mattered. Tarrytown had experience. It had skilled workers. It had decades of institutional memory, but memory could not widen the site. This is where the story becomes more painful than a simple tale of bad management or lost demand. The plant did not close because it suddenly forgot how to build cars. It did not close because the people inside no longer knew their work. It closed because the economics around the work had changed. By the 1970s and 1980s, General Motors faced a much harder market. Foreign competition intensified. Fuel crises changed what buyers wanted. Smaller cars became more important. Quality, efficiency, and cost discipline became harder to avoid. The old confidence of American automotive dominance began to weaken. GM remained enormous, but size was no longer only an advantage. It could also become weight: too many plants, too much capacity, too many legacy costs, too many older facilities competing for investment in a market that no longer guaranteed growth. For North Tarrytown, the cruel reality was this: the factory could still matter deeply to the town, while looking increasingly expendable to the corporation. That is one of the hardest truths of industrial. Decline, local importance, and corporate importance are not the same thing to the people who worked there. The plant was livelihood, memory, and identity. To the company, it was one facility among many, judged by cost, layout, capacity, product strategy, and long-term flexibility. Workers had adapted before. They had seen models change. They had seen the industry shift. They had kept the line running through problems outsiders never saw. In an old plant, worker knowledge becomes a hidden machine of its own. People know the awkward corners. They know where the layout fights the work. They know how to compensate for equipment space, timing, and pressure. But even skilled workers cannot overcome every structural limit. The last major chapter at Tarrytown came with GM's second-generation minivans, the Chevrolet Lumina APV, Pontiac Transport, and Oldsmobile Silhouette. On paper, the minivan was exactly the kind of product that should have mattered in a changing America. Families wanted practicality. They wanted space. They wanted something more useful than the old station wagon. Chrysler had already proved that the minivan market could be powerful. GM answered with a bold design. The vans built at Tarrytown looked futuristic, with long-sloped windshields and unusual proportions that made them stand apart from more conventional competitors. They were memorable. They were distinctive. They were hard to mistake for anything else on the road, but being distinctive is not the same as winning. The styling divided buyers. Competition was intense. The vans did not create the kind of market success that could secure the plant's future. And even if they had sold better, the deeper issue would have remained. Tarrytown was an old, constrained factory inside a company trying to reduce capacity. By the early 1990s, General Motors was announcing closures as part of a wider restructuring. Tarrytown was on the list. For the company, this was a production decision. For the village, it was something much larger. A closure announcement enters a town quietly at first. Through meetings, headlines, rumors, union conversations, kitchen tables, and uneasy looks between workers who do not want to say too much too soon, then it becomes personal. A worker who has spent 20 or 30 years inside the plant has to imagine life without it. A job that once seemed permanent is suddenly described as outdated. A building that once represented stability is now called inefficient. A skill that paid the bills may now require relocation, retraining, or compromise. A paycheck is never just a paycheck. It is a mortgage payment, a grocery bill, a medical decision, a child's school clothes, a plan for retirement, a sense of usefulness, a reason to get up before dawn and know where you are expected. When the final vehicle came off the line in June 1996, it was more than the end of production. It was the end of an arrangement between a company and a community. For decades, North Tarrytown had given the plant land, labor, infrastructure, patience, and loyalty. In return, the plant had given wages, tax revenue, structure, and identity. Now that bargain was finished, the silence after a factory closes is not ordinary quiet. A working plant has a living sound, tools, motors, compressed air, announcements, trucks, metal on metal, workers moving between stations, the pulse of a line that cannot stop without everyone knowing. When that sound disappears, the absence becomes physical. Streets feel different. Businesses lose customers. Suppliers lose orders. Families make decisions they had hoped to avoid. Some workers retire. Some transfer. Some search for work elsewhere. Some never replace what was lost. For a while, the buildings remained. But they no longer meant what they once had. A closed factory is a strange thing. It is too large to ignore and too empty to function. It contains memory, but no longer produces work. It becomes a monument before anyone has agreed on what it should commemorate. Then the demolition began. Taking down the Tarrytown GM plant did not simply clear land. It removed the physical evidence of nearly a century of industrial life. Brick walls fell. Steel was cut. Concrete remained. The outline of the old factory began to disappear from the riverfront. But industrial history does not vanish cleanly. It leaves marks in soil, water, infrastructure, and memory. The former GM site carried environmental concerns, including contamination, connected to historic industrial wastewater and river sediment. That part of the story matters because it prevents the past from becoming too simple. It is easy to remember a factory only through pride, wages, and production. Those things were real. But so were the costs. Polluted ground, altered shorelines, industrial waste, and cleanup responsibilities left to later generations. The Tarrytown plant was not only a victim of change, it was also part of an industrial age that often treated land and water as tools to be used first and repaired later. That makes nostalgia complicated. The factory gave people work. It supported families. It helped build American mobility. It gave North Tarrytown a place in the national economy, but it also created dependency. It concentrated risk. It tied a village's future to decisions made far away. And like many industrial sites of its era, it left behind environmental problems that redevelopment had to confront. After closure, the story became one of reinvention. In 1996, North Tarrytown officially became Sleepy Hollow, leaning into the historic and literary identity associated with Washington Irving. The timing was striking. In the same year the GM plant closed, the village began to present itself through a different kind of identity: heritage, tourism, the riverfront, and memory. The old industrial site eventually became part of the Edge on Hudson redevelopment vision. Housing, retail, public access, and new streets began replacing the old factory landscape. Where cars once rolled out, people would live. Where workers once entered through gates, residents and visitors would move toward the river. This kind of transformation has happened across the United States. Former factories become waterfront parcels. Brownfields become opportunities. Industrial land becomes mixed-use development. The language changes, and with it, the economy changes too. There is value in that. Empty, contaminated, unused land cannot remain frozen forever. Communities need housing, tax revenue, public space, cleanup, and new investment. A dead factory site can become dangerous and draining if nothing replaces it. But redevelopment raises a harder question. What replaces the life that was built around the work? A new apartment building is not the same as a union manufacturing job. A Riverview is not the same as a steady paycheck. A retail district may help a tax base, but it does not recreate the industrial world that disappeared. The transformation may be necessary. It may even be successful. But it is not a simple replacement. It is a different economy serving different needs, different lifestyles, and often different people. That is why the Tarrytown GM plant is not only a local story. It belongs to a larger history of American production. For much of the 20th century, manufacturing gave towns a physical center. People could point to a building and say, that is where the town earns its living. The factory was imperfect. It could be dangerous, polluting, exhausting, and unfair. But it gave industrial society a visible form. In the late 20th century, that form began to break apart. Production moved, consolidated, automated, or disappeared. Corporate strategy became less tied to local obligation. Older plants became liabilities. Workers were asked to adapt to decisions made in boardrooms, far from the communities that carried the consequences. Towns had to reinvent themselves through tourism, healthcare, education, logistics, services, real estate, or whatever else could fill the space left behind. The Tarrytown plant did not vanish because the town stopped needing it. It vanished because the system around it changed. And yet, something remains. It remains when people still call the land the GM site. It remains in old photographs of the plant along the river. It remains in memories of traffic after a shift ended, of lunch pails, uniforms, union meetings, and families who measured time by the factory schedule. It remains in stories told by people whose parents or grandparents worked the line. It remains in the cars that left the plant and traveled across America, carrying families who may never have known where their vehicle was built. A factory like Tarrytown can be demolished physically, but not historically. The walls can come down. The land can be cleaned. New streets can be drawn. New buildings can rise. But the deeper question stays visible for anyone willing to look closely. What does a country lose when the places that made its ordinary objects disappear? It loses jobs, but not only jobs. It loses routines, skills, bargaining power, local identity, a shared sense that useful work had a place, a sound, and a visible address. It loses the connection between a community and the things it produces. For nearly a century, the Tarrytown GM plant turned steel, glass, rubber, paint, and labor into vehicles that moved through American life. It began in the uncertain dawn of the automobile age, when steam still had a chance. It grew with Chevrolet. It matured under General Motors. It served during war. It fed a town through the long age of car culture. And it closed when the industrial logic that sustained it moved on. Its story is not only a tragedy, it is also a warning against easy nostalgia. The plant brought work, pride, and prosperity. It also brought pollution, dependence, and vulnerability. It made the town stronger, but it tied that strength to a company whose priorities could change. It gave generations a livelihood, but when the line stopped, The town had to discover who it was without the machine. Today, the Hudson still moves past the old site. It reflects new buildings, new roads, and new lives. The sound of the assembly line is gone. The gates are gone. The workers no longer pour out at shift change. But beneath the changed landscape is the memory of a factory that once gave North Tarrytown its industrial heartbeat. For nearly a century, Tarrytown helped build America's road to the future. Then the future drove away without it. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more forgotten factories, lost industries, and the hidden histories behind them, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps us keep these stories alive.